Yesterday we started thinking about how Peter Pan and Tinkerbell are revealing themselves to us. So today we're going to dive in a little bit deeper and try to find if we can get any evidence to support what we're thinking. Today as we read, we want to go back into the text. We want to find evidence that helps us understand the characters based on their thoughts, their words, and their actions. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights. And in the time we have taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaged through the wardrobe, and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light, as it made this light by flashing about so quickly. But when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinkerbell, who was exquisitely gowned in a skeleton. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars. Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinkerbell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. "Tinkerbell," he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle, as of golden bells, answered him. It was the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you'd heard it once before. Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers. And Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands as kings tossed halfpence to the crowd. In a moment, he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight, he forgot that he had shut Tinkerbell up in the drawer. After rereading this section of the text, I want to look back and find evidence that helps me understand Tinkerbell a little bit more. I want to know what she's revealing about herself. If I look back at paragraph 1, I actually learn a lot about her. I notice that she rummaged through the wardrobe, she's flashing about so quickly, that means she's moving so fast. This is telling me that Tink is eager to find the shadow. And because she's eager to find the shadow, it must mean that she's really eager to help Peter. Tinkerbell must be a very helpful person who loves Peter as a good friend and wants to help him a lot. That's what I'm learning about Tinkerbell, and this is what she's revealing about herself. Now I want to know what Peter's character is all about. What does he want to reveal about himself? I noticed that he carried Tinkerbell part of the way from probably Neverland to England, where Wendy lives. He also jumped at the drawers, forgot that he had shut Tinkerbell up in the drawer. What do these things tell me about Peter Pan? Right? But it tells me and what he's revealing about his character in the green box on the right. Now that we've learned about Tinkerbell and learned a little bit about Peter Pan, I want you to go back in the text and kind of find out what Wendy is revealing about herself. What does she say or do that helps us understand who she is? I also want you to look further in the story and see if Peter Pan reveals anything more about himself. We already know that he is a good friend to Tinkerbell, but he also seems very forgetful and kind of just into himself, where he kind of forgot that Tinkerbell was in the drawer and that he was the one who put her there, right? What else can we say about Peter Pan and Wendy? Follow along as I read the story Come Away, Come Away, an excerpt from the novel Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie. The well-known character Peter Pan, the adventurous boy from Neverland who refuses to grow up, first began his literary life in a 1902 novel for adults. Then he found fame in a 1904 play called Peter Pan, which was turned into a successful children's fantasy novel, Peter and Wendy, in 1911. Next came a Broadway musical, a TV movie, and an animated film about Peter, which made his character even more popular. In this chapter, early in the novel, Peter and the fairy Tinkerbell fly into the bedroom of a young girl named Wendy Darling, who lives in London, England. They are in search of Peter's shadow, which they left behind on a recent secret visit. Note how the narrator in the following passage, from chapter 3, sometimes interrupts the storytelling, addressing the reader directly. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights. And in the time we have taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaged the wardrobe, and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light, as it made this light by flashing about so quickly. But when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinkerbell, who was exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinkerbell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. Tinkerbell, he called softly, after making sure the children were asleep. Tink, where are you? She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where I put my shadow? The loveliest tinkle of the golden bells answered him. It was the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you have heard it before. Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers, and Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands as kings tossed halfpence to the crowd. In a moment, he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight, he forgot that he had shut Tinkerbell up in the drawer. If he had thought at all, but I don't believe he ever thought. It was that he and his shadow, when brought near each other, would join like drops of water. And when they did that, he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. He was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. He was only pleasantly interested. Boy, she said courteously, why are you crying? Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learned the grand manner at fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased and bowed beautifully to him from the bed. What's your name? He asked. Wendy Miura Angela Darling, she replied with some satisfaction. What is your name? Peter Pan. She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name. Is that all? Yes, he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was a short-ish name. I'm so sorry, said Wendy Miura Angela. It doesn't matter, Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. Second to the right, said Peter, and then straight on till morning. What a funny address! Peter had a sinking feeling. For the first time, he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. No, it isn't, he said. I mean, Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was the hostess. Is that what they put on the letters? He wished she had not mentioned letters. I don't get any letters, he said contemptuously. But your mother gets letters. Don't have a mother, he said. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of a tragedy. Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying, she said, got out of bed and ran to him. I wasn't crying about mothers, he said rather indignantly. I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying. It has come off? Yeah. Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. How awful, she said, but she could not help but smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. Oh, exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. It must be sewn on, she said, just a little patronizingly. What's sewn? He asked. You're dreadfully ignorant. No, I'm not. She was exulting in his ignorance. I shall sew it on for you, my little man, she said, though he was tall as herself. She got out her sewing bag and sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. I dare say it will hurt a little, she warned him. Oh, I shan't cry, said Peter, who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life. And he clenched his teeth and did not cry. As soon as his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. Perhaps I should have ironed it, Wendy said thoughtfully. But Peter, boylike, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached the shadow himself. How clever I am, he crowed rapturously. Oh, the cleverness of me! It is humiliating to have to confess the conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with brutal frankness, there was never a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. Braggart, she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. Of course I did nothing. You did a little, Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. A little, she replied with pride. If I am of no use, I can at least withdraw. Wendy, he said, don't withdraw. One girl is more use than 20 boys.